"Write in a book all the words I have spoken to you." That's the command God gives the prophet Jeremiah, and it's worth pausing on just how strange the choice actually was. He could have ordered the words memorized instead, passed by voice from generation to generation the way so much of the ancient world preserved its history. Instead, he chose the most fragile method available, ink pressed onto stretched animal hide, something that tears, that burns, that rots in the wrong climate within a couple of centuries. And yet the instruction was given anyway, copied by hand, generation after generation, scribe after scribe, across kingdoms that rose and collapsed, cities that burned, exiles that scattered entire populations across foreign empires. Somehow, against every practical reason it shouldn't have, the text survived long enough to reach a bookshelf on the other side of the world, thousands of years later. But there's a stretch of that journey almost nobody has ever actually seen. For most of history, the oldest complete Hebrew copies of the Old Testament that scholars could point to dated only to the Middle Ages, one manuscript from the year 1008 CE, another older but incomplete, both produced by scribes who devoted their entire working lives to copying scripture letter by letter with the discipline of surgeons. Beautiful work, meticulous work, but still work done well over 1,000 years after the prophets themselves had lived and written. Between the original texts and these medieval copies lay a gap in the historical record, a stretch of the road nobody had walked with their own eyes. Then, on an ordinary afternoon in 1947, in one of the driest, most forgotten corners of the earth, a boy tending goats threw a stone into a gap in a cliff face and heard something break. He had no idea what he'd just found. Something had been sealed inside that rock for nearly 2,000 years, waiting. The Judean Desert is not a place anyone would choose to hide a treasure on purpose. It sits along the shore of the Dead Sea, bone-dry and cracked, its cliffs riddled with crevices and hollowed caves, daytime heat regularly climbing past 40 degrees Celsius, the air carrying almost no humidity at all. Salt coats nearly everything. Almost nothing grows there. And that's precisely what makes the first beautiful detail of this story work. It's this ugly, punishing desert that preserves something no lush or hospitable place ever could have. Leather rots in humidity. Papyrus molds. Ink fades under direct light. In a normal climate, a handwritten scroll crumbles to dust within 2 or 3 centuries. But inside a sealed clay jar, inside a dark cave, in that dry salt-choked furnace of a landscape, leather holds. The desert air did the preservation work no library could ever manage on purpose. The boy's name was Muhammad Dib, a Bedouin from a family that had crossed this region with herds of goats for generations. He was around 15 years old, chasing a goat that had wandered off among the rocks, when he spotted a narrow opening in the cliff face too high for the animal to have climbed into alone. He threw a stone inside to startle it out, and instead of the dull sound of stone hitting stone, he heard pottery breaking. He came back later and climbed in. Inside stood tall, narrow clay jars, made to hold something long and rolled. Some still had their lids intact after 2,000 years, and inside several of them, wrapped in linen, sat scrolls of dark, dried leather that smelled of dust and stopped time. He didn't know what he'd found. He thought the leather might be useful for sandal straps. He carried some of it into town and sold it for a fraction of what it was worth, and that sale set off the largest search that stretch of desert had ever seen. Word of the sale spread quickly, and soon 2 separate groups were combing the same cliffs for more, Bedouin searchers working independently, and archaeologists arriving with brushes, notebooks, and considerably more patience. Between 1947 and 1956, crevice by crevice, cliff face by cliff face, the search eventually turned up 11 separate caves surrounding a site called Qumran, where the ruins of an ancient settlement still sat on the hillside below. From those 11 caves came material from roughly 900 distinct manuscripts. A handful were found nearly whole. Most were in pieces, tens of thousands of leather fragments, some no larger than a fingernail, mixed together, brittle as dry leaves. Reassembling it all became one of the largest puzzles ever attempted by human hands, and it took decades of careful, painstaking work to sort through. The collection held a striking range of material: hymns, community regulations, calendars for religious observance, even a thin engraved copper scroll listing what appeared to be a series of hidden locations. But the heart of the discovery was something else entirely: the biblical copies. Among the roughly 900 manuscripts, close to 230 were copies of Old Testament books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, the 12 minor prophets. Fragments of nearly every book in the Hebrew Bible turned up somewhere across those 11 caves. And that raises the question that makes this discovery matter so much to biblical scholarship: how old were these copies, exactly? The shape of Hebrew letters shifts slowly across centuries, functioning almost like a dating compass on its own, and combined with material testing on the leather and pottery itself, researchers arrived at a clear range. These copies were made somewhere between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, centuries before Jesus was born, in some cases closer to 200 years before. The scrolls were hidden, most likely, around the year 68 CE, as Roman legions advanced through the region during the Jewish revolt and the Qumran settlement itself faced destruction. Someone rolled the leather, wrapped it in linen, carried it down into the caves, pushed the jars back into the darkness, sealed them, and left, almost certainly intending to return once the fighting had passed. That person never came back. What they had hidden waited in that darkness for nearly 1900 years, until a boy chasing a lost goat threw a stone at exactly the right cave. What matters most in this story isn't the number of scrolls recovered, and it isn't the lingering mystery of who exactly lived at Qumran. It's a single, specific comparison, and it's worth walking through slowly, because it's where this discovery earns its real significance. Remember that gap mentioned earlier, the stretch of road in the dark between the prophets and the oldest Hebrew copy the world had access to? That oldest known copy dated to 1008 CE. The prophet Isaiah lived and wrote roughly in the 8th century BCE. Do the math, and the distance between Isaiah's own lifetime and that medieval copy comes out to somewhere around 1700 years, 1700 years of copying work nobody could actually verify, because everything earlier had been lost, burned, or simply worn away by time. Then came Cave 1, and out of one of its jars came what scholars now call the Great Isaiah Scroll. A single leather scroll made of 17 stitched sheets, joined edge to edge, measuring nearly 7.5 meters in length, 54 columns of handwritten Hebrew text, right to left, in the firm, practiced hand of someone who clearly knew the craft. And the content is the entire book of Isaiah, chapter 1 through chapter 66, without a missing chapter, without a missing block, the whole prophet, intact, small enough to hold. Scholars date this scroll to roughly 125 BCE. Sit with that date for a moment. Mary hadn't been born yet. Joseph hadn't been born yet. No angel had yet appeared in Nazareth. And there the scroll sat, complete, describing a coming servant who would be wounded for others' transgressions, waiting for the day that servant would actually walk through Galilee. Here's where the real significance of this find comes into focus. Researchers took that scroll, the Isaiah copy from 125 BCE, and placed it directly beside the medieval Hebrew copy from 1008 CE. Two copies, more than 1,000 years apart, separated by a millennium of tired hands, worn parchment, and candlelit copying sessions passed down between them. And then scholars read both, column by column, word by word. What they found was, for all practical purposes, the same book. Across 1,000 years of separation, the text was substantially identical. The differences that did turn up were overwhelmingly minor: a slightly different spelling of the same word, an extra letter that changed nothing about the meaning, the kind of small variation you'd expect any time two different people copy the same sentence by hand. Nothing that altered the message. Nothing that changed what the prophet had actually announced. Consider what that means in practice. A message had passed hand to hand across roughly 1,000 years of transmission, and when researchers finally brought the first copy in that chain face to face with one near the very end of it, the message was still there, whole, recognizable, unshaken. And it's worth noting that the very prophet inside that jar is the same one who wrote, "The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever," Isaiah chapter 40, verse 8. The scroll's own content became, in a sense, its own demonstration. What makes this comparison especially compelling is how it happened. There was no advance warning, no committee that agreed to stage a test, no possibility that anyone adjusted anything beforehand to make the two copies match. An ancient copy simply surfaced from the ground, more than 1,000 years older than anything scholars had previously held, and it said the same thing as the newer copy already sitting on library shelves. If the text had drifted or been altered across those centuries, this is exactly the moment that would have exposed it. There would have been no way to hide a mismatch between two versions nobody controlled the timing of. Instead, both held. Among the fragments recovered from these caves was a portion of Psalm 22, and it's worth remembering who wrote it and when. The psalm is attributed to David, who lived roughly 1,000 years before Jesus, centuries before crucifixion existed anywhere in the region as a method of execution. And yet the psalm describes a scene strikingly specific: a man surrounded and mocked, his strength gone, his mouth dry as broken pottery, his bones visible, and, in a detail that stands out, his hands and feet described as pierced, while onlookers divide his garments by casting lots for the last piece. Centuries later, the Gospel accounts describe almost exactly this scene unfolding at the crucifixion. Whether or not that phrase in Psalm 22 refers specifically to piercing is something scholars have long debated over textual and translation questions, but the parallel struck early Christian readers powerfully enough that it became one of the most cited Old Testament texts in connection with the crucifixion narrative. A second text worth pausing on comes from the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, near the end of the book. Verse 8 describes God dividing the nations of the earth and fixing their boundaries, and the manuscript tradition preserved among the Qumran scrolls, matching an ancient Greek translation made centuries before Christ, reads the verse with a phrase referring to the sons of God, rather than the more familiar later phrasing, the sons of Israel, found in medieval Hebrew copies. That reading connects directly to a concept Scripture references elsewhere: the heavenly assembly described in Job, in Psalm 82, in Psalm 89, divine beings present before God's throne. Centuries later, the Apostle Paul, addressing a crowd in Athens, echoed the same idea almost word for word, that God determined the appointed times and boundaries of every nation. It's the same theological thread, running from Moses through to Paul, and this scroll simply gave scholars an earlier window into the wording behind it. Then there's the third text, arguably the most significant of all, and it was preserved in full inside that nearly 7.5-meter scroll, Isaiah chapter 53. If there's a single chapter in the Old Testament that Christian readers immediately connect to Jesus, it's this one: a servant despised and rejected, described as a man of sorrows, familiar with suffering. Verse 5 describes him as wounded for others' transgressions, crushed for their iniquities, bearing punishment that brings others peace. Verse 7 describes him as oppressed and afflicted yet silent, led like a lamb to slaughter, not opening his mouth. Verse 9 places his grave among the wicked and the rich, despite having done no violence. Each of these details has long been read by Christian interpreters as strikingly consistent with the Gospel accounts of Jesus' trial, silence before his accusers, crucifixion between two criminals, and burial in the tomb of a wealthy follower. What makes the scroll itself significant to this discussion isn't that it changes the meaning of the chapter, it's the date. This entire chapter sat complete inside a scroll copied around 125 BCE, more than a century before Jesus was born, sealed in a jar in the desert, untouched by later hands. Whatever one makes of the theological reading, the manuscript evidence closes off one specific argument: that the passage was written or shaped after the fact to match events that had already occurred. The jar predates Christianity itself. Nobody adjusted this text to fit anything, because it was sealed in the ground before there was anything to fit it to. And that brings us to the real question at the center of this entire discovery: did these scrolls destabilize confidence in the biblical text, or did they demonstrate that it arrived intact? The evidence answers for itself. A scroll from 125 BCE and a codex from 1008 CE, 1,000 years apart, produced a text that was substantially the same, the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 present and unchanged in both. Today, the great Isaiah scroll is on permanent display in Jerusalem, at a site called the Shrine of the Book, part of the Israel Museum. The building itself was designed deliberately, its white, domed roof shaped to echo the lids of the very jars that once sealed these scrolls away in the desert. Inside, under carefully controlled light, protected now from the same heat and humidity that ironically could destroy what the desert once so effectively preserved, the scroll sits at the center of the room, nearly 7.5 meters of leather, 54 columns, the entire prophet intact. Visitors who walk into that room tend to go quiet without being asked to. There's something about the object itself that does it. What's on display are letters traced by a human hand more than a century before Jesus was born, a scribe whose name nobody recorded, who sat somewhere in that desert, dipping a reed pen, copying letter by letter, with no way of knowing that 2,000 years later, on the other side of the planet, people would be reading the results of his work. From a research and preservation standpoint, the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls comes down to exactly this, an unbroken thread of transmission, checked by surprise against a copy nobody controlled the timing of, holding firm across roughly 1,000 years and, by extension, across the far longer span back to the text's original composition. The scroll that survived wasn't a random selection either. Of everything that could have come out of that desert hole, it was Isaiah, the prophet most closely associated with the servant figure central to Christian theology, that emerged complete. Today the scroll sits a few kilometers from the hill traditionally associated with the crucifixion itself, under a roof shaped like the very jar lids that sealed it away. 2,000 years of silence, and then a stone, thrown by accident, by a boy chasing a goat across a desert nobody else wanted.